to see everyone out this morning. If you would like to take out your lesson book, we're on page 95 in our review of the United Kingdom. And of course, we don't mean the United Kingdom as we talk about today. And as we talk as well, when we get into our discussions of the Bible time periods, what does the idea of the United Kingdom imply? If a kingdom's united, it's not divided. But we are going to have the divided kingdom after this. And so this morning, hopefully, we'll be able to go through this review of the United Kingdom and make some comments as we go. And then we'll go through an overview of the divided kingdom. And I really like the way that that Brother Waldron went through the information, of course, and the points he makes in the next lesson, I think, are very, very helpful to understand the whole overall aspect of the divided kingdom. Easy for us to get lost in the weeds in the divided kingdom. United Kingdom is pretty simple, although in the latter stage of the reign of David, it might get a little complicated. When you read through these histories, we want to keep in mind the overall point that God is making. And we've already kind of discussed that over the past couple of weeks, how God was intending with David to have the exact kind of king that he wanted, or that he talked about back in Deuteronomy. With David, it's the best that Israel got as a kingdom. With Solomon, it was the best that Israel got as far as wealth and prominence. But Solomon himself had some character flaws, as we talked about, that severely affected everything else. And it's interesting, too, because David had some flaws of his own, didn't he? But God made great promises to David, as we'll talk about as well. So, any general comments about the United Kingdom period before we go into this review?
Well, let's just say Samuel, by God, indicated what it would be like to have a king.
Right? Yep. And the people didn't really know what they were asking for. And he kind of let them know, well, this is what he's going to do. And we'll talk about what that really meant and what that ended up being. So we're reviewing lessons 22 through 24. And we want to remember some basic things. Saul was king over all Israel, technically. But he didn't have all the land that God promised to Israel. And the reason for that was, ultimately, his own weakness and things like that he wasn't able to conquer what he needed to conquer. If he had had more time, possibly, that might have been a thing. But really, I don't think God was going to give him that. And generally, as we see time goes on, we can see the difference here. The green area is the places that David conquered. It didn't mean that those green areas necessarily became a part of Israel. It just meant at the very least that those nations were basically kicking a tribute to David, that he was able to tax them. And so Moab and Ammon, David didn't really conquer them in the sense that Israelites moved there and things like that, but rather those countries paid tribute to David. And that continued on through the reign of Solomon. And so let's look at our first question. We've already kind of talked about this a little bit. Who was the judge at the time that the people asked for a king? Samuel. And as we talked about, Samuel is the one to warn them about this. And Samuel, you think about all that he did. That guy was just, he was a hero. I mean, in many ways. And I remember always, I think it's in chapter 10, where Samuel addresses them and essentially says chapter 12, chapter 12. He basically says, I haven't cheated or oppressed you. And he's kind of reflecting on his time as a judge. And he's saying, anybody that I've done dirty, basically, let it be known right now. And the people almost unifyingly say, well, no, you haven't done anything wrong against us. Which is interesting, too, because, again, you go back to what were Samuel's sons like? Were they good men? No, they were lousy. They were
sons.
They were like Eli's sons in a way. They were greedy, and so that wasn't good. But the fact that the people here don't really hold him to account for his sons, it does kind of make an interesting point where it's kind of like, okay, he did the best he could, it seems, and it seems like he did what he needed to do about them. But anyway, I don't want to go too far with that. But this was the last judge, Samuel. And why did the people say they wanted a king?
Well, they like everybody else.
They wanted to be like the other nations.
Yes.
God was their king.
Yes. They wanted to be like the other nations. When you're surrounded by people that have kings, they're able to, do a bunch of things and muster a bunch of big things and do a bunch of things that perhaps the tribes weren't able to do. And think about the inverse of this. What did Joshua and that generation do when they invaded Canaan? What's one of the first things they did as they went through the land in these campaigns? Who were they taking out?
What God told them to take out.
Okay.
Not all of them, but
right. But who did they put down? Who did they go ahead?
the kings.
The kings. Yeah. They cut off the head administrative authorities of those areas. And so after that power that they had with their kingship was kind of broken. And the thing about that is that maybe the people were thinking, well, we're weaker because we don't have a king. And maybe we're less safe because we don't have a king. Yes, sir.
I can say that this nation, the first thing they wanted to do was make George Washington the king. And he said, that's what we came away from. Why do you want to?
Sure. Yeah.
And the British, boy, they love that royal family.
Mm-hmm.
Although they're just more or less a figurehead, there's something about having a king really appeals to people, it appears.
Well, it appeals to people because of what? Who made us?
God.
So God made us to want him. But what we're doing is we're trying to search for everything else we can except for him. And I think this is another instance of that. They want to be like the other nations. Summarize the warnings that Samuel gave as to what a king would be like. Yes,
I
ma'am.
want to ask you,
Oh, sure.
do you think that's where they got that song, Bear This Man Like Joshua? What do you think that the meaning of that song is?
Yeah, I think that goes back to Joshua 24, where Joshua assembles Israel at Shechem, and he says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And he tells them, make the choice, whether you serve the gods that were beyond the river that your fathers served. And what he's really talking about is the river Euphrates. And past that was Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham lived back in the day before he came to Canaan. And so he's basically saying, make up your mind about who you're going to serve. And so, yeah, I think that's spot on. What was Samuel warning them about?
The king would do pretty much what he wants to do.
Yeah, basically whatever he wants. I put down in my notes that he would take everything. that's basically what it is. When he looks at it, he's going to take your lands, he's going to take your children, he's going to take everything, and it's all going to be in service to him. And this is something that is really interesting to me because, again, it's a matter where we look back to the time of the judges as just, awful. Everybody did what was right in his own eyes. And there are some awful times in the times of the judges, but there are some times where you see they had 40 years of peace, being faithful to God. So there's an interesting thing there where as long as God was their king, there was a lot more hope for them, being faithful in the long run. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm in my daily reading, I am in the book of Judges, and there was one place, I've got to where I'm just kind of boxing in the periods of peace, and we've already talked about it, but in one time there were 80 years of peace.
Yes.
You talk about nearly a century of peace. That's amazing.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Samuel also warned them that the Lord would not hear them.
Yeah.
Yeah, when they realize that this was the wrong choice, and they cry out for, the Lord's not going to listen to that because they'd already asked for it. He, in grace, he really should punish them, but he relents from doing that, and he gives them everything they want. And that makes me think about how, there are some times where it seems like the Lord gives us everything we need to go wrong. but he's still holding out that hand and saying, it's, if you return to me, so.
Makes me think of that phrase, be careful what you wish for.
Sure, absolutely. Ken, did I see your hand?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if God gives you everything that your heart desires, it's almost a curse.
Yes, yeah. So that's kind of like with the Tower of Babel. So one of the things that God says about the Tower of Babel, they're building it up, and because they want to be remembered, they want to, so that we aren't forgotten. Mm-hmm. And God says, well, now nothing will be withheld from them. And what he talks about there is really, back in that time, that was essentially a united humanity building the Tower of Babel. And God wants humanity united, but for his purpose. And that's how we come together. So the Tower of Babel and the day of Pentecost are the inverse of each other. You ever think about that? So God divided the peoples by confusing their language, but then with Pentecost, he gathered them together by uniting their language, by uniting their understanding. And so you bring that up, kind of goes along with this flow of understanding that I have to, submitting to God is something that may not seem popular. It may seem actually dangerous in some scenarios, but that's what we have to do. God has to be our king. God has to be our leader. So, anything else on that? Yes, sir.
Monarchical structures throughout history. If you have a king, was there also learning about how the succession of that would go through the bloodline of that person?
Yes. Yeah, and we're going to be talking about bloodlines a lot with this. I didn't hear all of your comment though. I'm sorry.
The start of it was, and I try to watch how loud I am. As we've seen through monarchical structures throughout history, and certainly that we see today, there's always the bloodline of the succession. So not only are you putting the king in place, but his bloodline is going to rule you.
Right.
Throughout.
That's a fantastic point because that's going to be something that it's not just this guy. It's going to be down the road. And of course, the distinction here is God would kind of guide this and provide some aspect through the prophets, through Samuel, through Nathan later, this aspect of, okay, this is who's going to rule in your stead. So that was really the big distinction between the kings of Israel and the kings of the rest of the world. Because really, when you think about David and Saul and Jonathan, Saul really wanted Jonathan to be the next king. He really wanted Jonathan to be the next ruler. But Jonathan wasn't, I don't know if Jonathan wasn't interested in that, but Jonathan was on board for David being the next king. And then you think about how Absalom, I believe, was David's firstborn. He really, technically, by the rules of the world, should have been the next king, but God chose Solomon to be the next king. So that's the distinction here. But what you're saying is so spot on that like that ongoing aspect of this trouble was going to be there. Anything else there? What two events in Saul's life demonstrated his unworthiness to be the kind of king God wanted? Yes, sir.
He failed to destroy all of Amalek,
Mm-hmm.
and he offered unauthorized sacrifice.
There you go. It's comparable in some way that the inappropriate sacrifice. Why was it inappropriate? Why was it unauthorized?
He wasn't a priest for it.
He wasn't a priest. He wasn't of the tribe of Levi, was he? Now, not everybody in the tribe of Levi was a priest, but to be a priest of the priestly tribe, you had to be part of all that. So it's kind of a similar mistake as Uzziah later makes, 100 years later, where he offers incense in the temple, and he's struck with leprosy till the rest of his days for that. But yeah, Saul, why did he offer that sacrifice? What was he worried about? What was he scared of?
He was in a hurry. I think he was in a hurry.
In a hurry, yeah.
Impatient.
The Philistines were about to attack, and then he plays the blame game with Saul. Samuel, you came not in the time that you were supposed to. It's your fault, Samuel. So I forced myself, and I said, I've got to do this, and I offered it. Self-justification was Saul's thing.
Yeah, he's waiting for Samuel to show up, and he's so intimidated by this other force. And I think that's the key of it. It's his lack of faith that really is at the core of it, and that manifests in different ways. When we talk about his lack of willingness to completely destroy the Amalekites, someone might say, well, maybe he had compassion on them or something. Well, I don't think that's the case. I think it's a moment where he's saying, well, we can keep these alive, and we'll keep all the best stuff, and we'll sacrifice it to God. And, he took God's plan and he tweaked it. Yeah. And he thought by tweaking God's plan, it's going to be more pleasing to him, which is very similar error that a lot of people make today. All right, so anything else on that?
I just would think that some of it had to do with David's promos with the people. That may have some effect on it.
Sure. Did I hear something over here?
I was going to say that he was very full of pride. He brings back the king, and he's standing up there, look what we've done, and all this. He's trying to get all these accolades for himself. Generally, when people do those types of things, and they've got to be the most important ones, and then pride's really what ruins their life.
Yeah. And it's sad, too. It really is sad at the end of that chapter where you see him, all he wants is for Samuel just to come with him to the sacrifice, just act like nothing's wrong, and, it's just a really sad scenario.
Years ago at the 70s, when 77 Street in Birmingham had lectures, Larry Rouse did a sermon, an entire sermon on Saul, and he named it The Plague of Pride.
Mm-hmm.
And it was either in that sermon or another sermon, he talked about that pride is essentially competitive. I've got to be number one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Saul is, I'm trying not to spend too much time with this, but I think this bears repeating. I've said it before. Saul really is a case in point where you see mental dysfunction. Mm-hmm. Really, when you're so angry, when you're angry enough to throw a spear at your own son, there's something going wrong up here. And it's not that Saul just had some chemical imbalance. It all goes back to sin. And I think in a general way, we understand that any kind of those issues that come up, they all go back to sin. Not necessarily my sin. It could be someone else's sin. It could be something else that had happened that has even no connection to myself. that may be the cause of that. So it's not a matter of like, well, if you have some kind of mental trouble, then that means that you're sinning before God. Not necessarily. It might be somebody else. So the whole thing that with Saul was he allowed this prideful attitude to influence his actions, to do horrible things. I mean, the slaughter of the priests at Nob. I mean, that's insane. That's insane stuff. And so, but that all happened because he allowed that prideful attitude to just take over his life. And yes, we read and we say that he received an evil spirit from the Lord, but it's very similar. We go back to, that's another conversation, but we go back to the Pharaoh in Exodus. Pharaoh hardened his heart because he already had a hard heart. He didn't believe in God to start with. That's the problem, and that's the problem with Saul. He had these early moments of humility and strength, but that gave out very quickly. Yes, sir.
In every one of these instances where he does something that he should not have, he has a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Just like we all have a choice, that free moral agency. God didn't force him to do what he did. He did because he wanted to.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Let's talk about that. The next question has a lot to do with that. Why did Saul want to kill David?
Jealousy.
Yeah.
Envy.
Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. I wonder sometimes if that made a better cadence in the original language. Maybe that. But David became more popular than him. Now, that wasn't because David was pushing or promoting himself. Just because David was being who he was. You know, and it's interesting, too, that even Saul's own actions contributed to this. He wants David to bring him a number of foreskins from the Philistines, and David goes out and does it, and then he's mad that he did it. So, yes, sir. Brother Allen, did I see your hand? I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
He was also afraid David was going to take the kingdom from Jonathan.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
He knew that David was not alive, that Jonathan would be the heir.
Yes. Yep.
I'm just thinking that sending, David out to collect all this stuff, it's like, he's not gonna be able to do that, so he's gonna be, dead. That's
Yeah. Yeah.
so it's-
And it's sad, too, that, like, thinking ahead to David's rule, the one time he was the most like Saul was when he ordered Uriah, that Uriah be put in the front of the battle. And it's that kind of adds another layer to me, where it's like, that's the only time in his reign that I think he's probably a little bit more like Saul. He's willing to take one of his mighty men, and throw him into an unwinnable conflict.
So Uriah was very loyal to
Yeah.
David.
Oh, yeah.
To the kingdom, actually.
Yeah. All of his
Tried to
mighty
get him
men
to
were.
sleep with his wife.
Yeah.
That, no, my buddies are out there in the field fighting.
Yes.
I don't deserve to have that liberty.
Yeah. You read in the Chronicles about David's mighty men, and he makes one mention, I wish I could drink from the well of Bethlehem.
Right.
And they go into enemy territory to go do that, and they get this water from Bethlehem, and David's impressed by it, but he pours it out to the Lord. But the fact that they did that, they loved him. They loved him just as much as the apostles loved Jesus. And there's a lot of interesting parallels there. Anyway, let's see. Zooming ahead, what did David want to build? A temple to God. Hey, I'm living in this palace of cedar, but the ark of God is in a tent. It didn't make sense to him, rightly so. At first, Nathan the prophet says, well, go ahead, do what's in your heart. But then the word of the Lord comes to Nathan and keeps David from doing that. Why was David not allowed to build this temple?
David slain many men.
Mm-hmm.
He was a warrior. He was a man of blood.
He was a man of blood. He had waged these wars, which, the funny thing is, you think about God had essentially commanded that these conflicts be made, but it was his hand in all of this. So there's something involved with violence, I think. As you look all throughout the Bible, God hates violence. And it's difficult for us to parse out sometimes because, well, sometimes he orders that violence be done, or he's done that in the Old Testament. But when he does that, it's for a specific cause, for a specific purpose, and he has the beginning and end in mind. And so I think that's important for us to keep in mind. So David, he was a man of blood. God needed somebody who hadn't fought those wars. He needed essentially a peacetime king. And so that leads us to the next question. Let's summarize the promise that God made to David. What did he promise David?
That a person as this man would always be on the throne.
Yes. That his kingdom would be established from his descendants. That his throne would be forever. Now that's an interesting thing too, because God, on the one hand, he's saying, you can't build the temple. I'm not going to let you. But at the same time, he says, but I'm going to give you this amazing promise. Look at this. How your throne will stand forever. Now, when we talk about throne there, we're not talking about the literal physical throne of David. And we talked about that before. This is the sense of the authority, the rulership of David. And what we learn in Acts chapter 2 is that who is sitting now upon the throne of David in heaven? Jesus. Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father in heaven. He reigns in his kingdom today. And that is the full fulfillment of this promise. Now, there are other aspects of this promise that have to do with Solomon, that have to do with the line of Judah throughout the reign of the divided kingdom. But that's all that's really good for us to keep in mind. What grievous event marked a turning point in David's life? We've already mentioned that.
Adultery with Bathsheba.
Yeah. And having Uriah killed. And it's still nutty to me. We mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, how it really seems like for a while David was thinking he would get away with it. That he's, Uriah's dead, and now I've married Bathsheba, and so everybody can kind of assume that this is my child and it won't be any issue. So that led to a lot of problems for David. Moving forward to Solomon, what did Solomon ask God for?
Wisdom.
Wisdom. Understanding the heart. And then what did God give him? More than that, right? Overflowing. Wisdom and riches and a long life. But of course we remember this is similar to the blessings and cursings. If you're faithful to me, you're gonna reign for a long time. But sadly he wasn't. We talk about Solomon, and we always hope that Ecclesiastes was written in his older years. You would hope that would be the case, that somewhere along the line he turned around. But the sad thing is, when you read the histories, it kind of looks like Solomon probably didn't turn around. But we just don't know. The Bible doesn't answer that for us. And I think that is actually very helpful for us to learn. It's kind of like at the end of the story of the prodigal son. You remember the brother of the prodigal son? And the last thing in that story is the father saying, all that I have is yours. And shouldn't we make merry about your brother returning?
Right.
And the story ends there. You don't see anything else about how that brother reacts to it. And I think the reason for that is Jesus tells us that and teaches that story, and it's left in our lap. What are we going to do with that? And it's left for us to kind of make a decision and a judgment. Same thing here. If, we're given immense riches and wealth, and every one of us in one way or another, what are we going to do with that? Are we going to like Solomon, are we going to allow our lives to be diluted and polluted by sin and halfway measures that just sort of marriage in with these things? This guy built places for his pagan wives to live, and separate from Israel, and it's bizarre to think about, but let's think further about the good things of Solomon. I'm pulling off here. Let's summarize Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple. What did he say? What was he hoping God would do?
Hear the prayers that people pray toward the temple.
Yes. Now that stretches on for quite a while, right? That idea? Because where do we see in Daniel chapter 6, what direction does Daniel pray?
To the east.
Toward the temple.
Toward the temple.
Toward Jerusalem. And that was because Daniel knew the word and he understood the direction to pray. Now, today, that's not the case. We don't have any particular direction we have to pray. That's not the case there. But this was the thought, is that Solomon prayed that when they prayed toward the temple, that they would do that. And what was God's answer to Solomon's prayer?
He said, I've heard you.
Yeah. And I think also, don't you see in chapter 9 sort of a restatement of the blessings and cursings aspect, that if you're faithful to me, and that's the thing, Solomon, so I mentioned a little bit of this a couple weeks ago, David and his mighty men are parallel to Jesus and the apostles in a sense, and then Solomon and the temple are kind of parallel to the church and the establishment of the kingdom in the book of Acts. And the reason I say that is that the universal church has been established. The kingdom is there. Nothing will ever shake it. Nothing will ever stop it. And everyone who wants to be a part of this kingdom can be a part of this kingdom. All you have to do is to hold close to God and be faithful and follow his word. The Jews under Solomon, all they had to do with that temple was to be faithful and to keep up what God had commanded to them. Same thing for Solomon and everybody involved. But they were not faithful. Now the difference is that Solomon himself, the king of that kingdom, was not perfect. He wasn't like Jesus. He was, in some senses with his wisdom, of course, he would be similar. But he married these foreign women, allowed them to pull his soul away from the Lord. That's what we see in the next few questions. But there's some interesting parallels here. Why did God tell Solomon his kingdom would be divided? I just basically said it. Yeah. Yeah, his heart was turned from God through the women that he had married. And he had actually taken part in idol worship with them from time to time. Yes, sir?
I've always wondered what happened to Solomon's wisdom in this book.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so somebody made the comment, it may have been you, Brother Albie, is that he didn't conquer like David conquered. He conquered through marriage, through intermarrying. It may have been you as well, Brother Billy. And I think that's a pretty astute observation, where you see him dominating the area in a very vast way. But ultimately, he makes a lot of ties that pulled his heart away from the Lord. And why was it not going to be torn away in his day? It was going to happen after he dies, right? And it was because of David. This is where we see, and this is again a very good lesson for us, that God keeps his promises. He will not just say, I'm going to do this, and then just do something else down the line. He keeps his promises. And you go all the way through the divided kingdom, and you note the times where you have a particularly bad ruler in Judah. The first few kings in Judah that are really bad, you see the text say, nevertheless, God did not take away their rulership. He kept a light for David in Jerusalem. Let's see. Saul was from what tribe? Benjamin. How about David?
Judah.
And how about Jesus?
Judah.
Yep. Absolutely. And we make that comparison to kind of pull us together in the seed promise, and this is really what's happening here. Saul wasn't going to bring about the fruition of the seed promise. Only David could. by God's plan. And let's see. Yeah, who was a man after God's own heart? David. Yeah. And let's see. I'm looking. Yeah. We haven't made a lot of headway here, so let's keep moving. One who loved many strange women. Solomon. Who is one who was head and shoulders taller than the people? Saul. Saul was an impressive looking guy. David called him the Lord's anointed. Saul. We're told from the sole of his foot even to the crown of his head there was no blemish in him. Who was that? Absalom, David's son. He was a good looking guy. And I think the people that started following him said, okay, this is the way to go.
But their presence, it looks like.
Yes.
Some of them.
Yes. Who was anointed to be the captain of God's inheritance? Saul. And what's interesting is this is said by Samuel around the time that he offers that sacrifice. Who was wiser than any man before or since? Solomon. Tyre was the chief city of who? The Phoenicians. And so there it is, right up there in northwest Canaan. David took the city of Jerusalem from the Jebusites. Hadad was what? An Edomite. And he returned from Egypt to reestablish his own country. We see that in 1 Kings 11. Rezin established a city-state in Damascus. That's what we see in 1 Kings 11. God sent Saul to destroy who? The Amalekites. I appreciate that involvement there. Thank y'all so much for the answers. Who was afraid to help the blank? The Syrians or Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites. And why was that, by the way? It was because David was just mopping the floor with everybody. David was tearing up the town. Israel's worst enemy in Saul's day were the Philistines. And very good. Solomon married the daughter of the king of Egypt. David took his parents where for safety? Moab, Mizpah of Moab. And I've mentioned this before as well. I think the reason David took them there was because of his ancestor Ruth. I think that would have been his grandma, great-grandma. Anyway.
Back, she was the mother of, I didn't know, man. Ruth.
There's a couple of generations there. I'd have to look back at Ruth to kind of see there. But yeah. So it would make sense that David would take them there, actually. Which queen came to see and hear Solomon's wisdom and wealth? Queen of Sheba. What was the first city that Saul defended? Jabesh Gilead. And I love that story. And I love the story because it connects back to Saul's death. Because it was the men of Jabesh Gilead that took Saul's body from the Philistines so that they couldn't make a mockery of it. The home port for Solomon's navy that sailed on the Red Sea, where was that? Ezion Geber. And you can see the port city right there. And that's where, there's a couple of things to remember there. And we talk about the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba. That's going pretty far out when you think about the land. There was a second navy of Solomon's that sailed from here every 3 years. Where did they sail from? From Tyre. They went from Tyre to Tarshish. It was a route that they talked about in 1 Kings 10:22. So on both ends, he's got seafaring trade, which means you can get items from much farther away. And that technology was there. The place where Saul died, where was that? Mount Gilboa in the fight with the Philistines there. And then what was Saul's capital? Gibeah, which is different from Gibeon. Those are two different places. But you see how close it is to Jerusalem, but that's where his capital is. Where was David's first capital? Hebron. Farther to the south there. That's where Hebron is. Then David's second capital? Jerusalem.
He kicked out the Jebusites.
He sure did.
King, anyway.
Where did David pretend insanity?
Yeah.
Gath. That's going back some too.
Yeah.
How far were the people of Solomon's day at peace?
Dan to Beersheba.
From Dan to Beersheba, and here's the
What a boundary.
yeah, that's
city.
how far it goes. Yeah, from the north to the south. David's headquarters while he was fleeing from Absalom, where did he go? Mahanaim. Mahanaim?
How do you pronounce it?
Yeah. Where did the people ask for a king? Ramah. And Ramah was where Samuel's home was. David built a stronghold in this cave while he was fleeing from Saul. Which cave was that? Cave of Adullam. And then David's hometown? Bethlehem. Interesting place.
Hometown
I wonder what happens later on there.
Jesus is born there.
Absolutely. King Achish gave David which city? Ziklag. And there's Ziklag right there. You can see that's farther to the south as well. Solomon used cedars from here for building the temple. Where did he get them from?
Cedars of Lebanon.
Cedars of Lebanon. From the Lebanon mountains. And the forests of Lebanon are talked about and thought about. But the funny thing about that is, when you look at Lebanon today, do you see a lot of woods up there? It's pretty barren.
Had a lot of battles there.
Yes.
A lot of warfare.
Sure did. David's chief captain was? Joab. Tough dude. Saul's chief captain was? Abner. The person who called Samuel from the dead, who was that?
That was Saul.
Saul, witch of Endor. I think both would be that in that sense.
He went through her, but actually it was God that brought Samuel.
Right. Because she's half terrified or completely terrified when it happens.
Yeah, because he killed a lot of them.
Who was the giant David killed? Everybody knows that. David's best friend during his early years, Jonathan. Saul's daughter, who became David's wife, who was that? Michal, however you want to pronounce it. The son of Saul who reigned for a time, Ishbosheth. And then David's sons who led rebellions against him. Absalom and Adonijah. That's what we see in those passages there.
Absalom.
And Adonijah in 1 Kings 1. The one that David committed adultery with, Bathsheba. The prophet David consulted about building the temple, Nathan. Who was the king of Tyre? Hiram. All right, and then this fellow had another slide with some more review of who is in order here, but we're going to skip over that today. Let's go forward a little bit. Let's spend a little bit of time today. We've got about 15 more minutes. Let's see if we can go through our overview of the divided kingdom.
Steve,
Yes, sir.
is this Hiram Tyre, I looked at this over ways, is he the one that one of our secret societies do?
I know what you're talking about. So the Freemasons talk about Hiram Abiff. Yeah, and that's a whole different kettle of fish. I don't believe that the Hiram of the Bible has anything to do with the guy they talk about. Because the guy they talk about him as if he's just this superhero figure, just great guy or whatever. But one thing you got to understand about what they say and what they write about, it's all allegorical to them. They don't really believe per se that a person like that existed. They're talking more about the general idea of who that person is. And it all kind of goes back to that aspect of just trying to control others. I think that's what it really goes back to.
They had so much control during the Dark Ages, Middle Ages.
Yeah.
With the Knights Templar.
Sure.
I've always wondered, is this the same? Hiram was a builder.
Yes,
And
yeah.
the person that they hired to do all the master goldsmith and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It seems to be the one that the Freemasons tell me is who they observe.
Yes, and I've understood that there are some passages in their writings that talk about how Hiram was wiser than Solomon or better than Solomon, and how Solomon wasn't quite as good or whatever. And that's just like that's the works of man trying to trumpet itself over God. And the sad thing about that is, to me too, that's almost another thing where the things that Solomon did really gave fuel to the fire for people to try to theorize all this other stuff. Where those people will kind of talk about how Solomon was a great wizard and sorcerer and stuff like that, like insane stuff that the Bible never even talks about. Now, I can see where you might get there if he's involved in idol worship and things like that. But the thing about Solomon is, it seems like he tried to keep it separate from what the text kind of says. And he would join in with some of that idol worship with his wives, but he always kind of kept that separate from the worship of God. He didn't intermix it. I'm not saying that defends him, but I think that's just a point where we trust the text over what man says. So,
Well, I think the book of Ecclesiastes kind of skirts all of that, talking about vanity and the things he got involved with. He might not have per se mentioned all the strange wives, but he sought for knowledge in all the wrong places.
yes, absolutely.
He was interested. Some things that he, looked for knowledge in, that was good, but
Mm-hmm.
he just went overboard.
He did. Sir.
You mentioned a while ago, we don't know what Solomon did in his later life, if he ever came back. When Ecclesiastes closes, I believe it's the last verse and the last two verses.
Mm-hmm.
He says the whole duty or the whole of man is to fear God and
Mm-hmm.
his commandments. That sounds like a man.
Oh yeah. Well, and that's where I say, like, if he wrote that earlier on, maybe he wrote that earlier on in his life. I don't know, but that's the tough part about it is that But yeah, no. What the end of that book lays it out entirely, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. But this, his death marks the close of Israel's glory. They never have God's blessings like they did in the days of David and Solomon. Remember, we talked about the wealth of Solomon. How what was in Solomon's reign? How did they regard silver? Yeah, it's like the stones of a road. It's which the funny thing about that is, like, silver even today is sort of this hedge kind of commodity where it's kind of a good in between, right? Gold bugs will talk about how, like, you build up enough silver and then you can kind of, when it's high enough, you can transfer it to gold and things like that. But that's the amount that we have with Solomon, and that wealth of Solomon is going to stretch for hundreds of years, even throughout the kingdom of Judah. So, but the day came to anoint Solomon's son Rehoboam as king. The people gathered at Shechem, which again is very fitting. The first place that Abraham landed in Canaan when he came from the Ur of the Chaldees. This was the place where Joshua called the people to faithfulness in his day. So Shechem is a very important spot. The people asked Rehoboam to lighten their burdens. Remember all the people that had helped build the temple, and not just the temple, but all the administrative buildings and all the projects that Solomon authorized. But Rehoboam refused to lighten their burdens. He didn't listen to his father's advisors. He listened to his younger friends. And he boasted that it's going to be even harder under him. And so Jeroboam became king of the 10 northern tribes, as the prophet Ahijah had predicted. This was, in some ways, this was a workers' uprising, where the main guy who was sort of over the workers, Jeroboam, he instituted... Now, the interesting thing is, he had been told by God, you will rule, while Solomon was still alive. And Solomon sought to kill him. And so he flees to Egypt until Solomon's dead. And then he comes back and he gains the 10 northern tribes. They keep the name of Israel. It's the northern kingdom of Israel. And only Benjamin and Judah are left under Rehoboam. And Simeon at that point was incorporated as part of Judah around by this time in Bible history. Simeon was such a smaller tribe that they just kind of blended into the tribe of Judah. Jerusalem was on the border between the two tribes of Benjamin and Judah. And Rehoboam was of the tribe of Judah, so they took the name of the kingdom of Judah. And so they kept control of the temple, the palace, the capital city. And all of this goes back to instances, and I appreciate how Brother Waldron mentions this, of the jealousy between the tribes. You go back to how Ephraim showed resentment in the days of Gideon because they hadn't been called to a particular battle. Benjamin chose to fight rather than submit to the other tribes during the days of the judges. And then the northern tribes were jealous when David returned after the rebellion of Absalom. You didn't call us to the battle against. And this friction existed between the tribes in Solomon's day. And so this is one of these things where we see how if we don't address problems, they bubble to the surface. If we don't work on things and try to build relationships and grow closer together, then latent issues can bubble up and become a problem later on. And so jealousy, envy now brings two tiny kingdoms. There, it's funny to think about. You had this massive force beforehand in the days of Solomon, but now that's essentially halved as far as the land is concerned. And both kingdoms could have been blessed if they remained faithful to God. It really could have worked because this. Remember, I don't want to go too far here. We're going to end in just a minute, but when this happened, when Jeroboam took these tribes, what did Rehoboam do? Can anybody tell me? What was something that Rehoboam tried to do? Does anybody remember?
He built the two golden calves.
Well, no, Jeroboam did that. That's later on. What's one of the first things that Rehoboam tried to do? He's got this kingdom that's formed that takes 10 of the tribes away.
I may be way off. Did he build something that was almost a place of worship, and they're almost...
No, Rehoboam didn't do that.
Okay.
Rehoboam didn't do that. Rehoboam tried to go and try to take him back. He's starting to mobilize to just go and force them to rejoin the kingdom. And you know what? God sent him word by a prophet that says, don't do this. Go back home. This is of me.
That's right.
And we can dog on Rehoboam for a lot of reasons. This guy made some very foolish mistakes. But in that scenario, he at least listened to God. And he went back. He didn't try to go by military campaign take them back over. And but the Bible tells us there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all the days of their life. And I don't think that literally means like physical battles. I think that just means there was a hostility there. They weren't going to be hanging out together. So Jeroboam's dynasty, God made the same kind of promise to Jeroboam as he did to David. And that's interesting to me. But if he remained faithful, but neither kingdom remained faithful to God. Jeroboam was afraid he would lose control of his kingdom. He's afraid of the people going back to Judah. But Ahijah had promised it would be his if he would remain faithful. Well, that lack of faith led to his own fear. And so he built golden calves and placed them at Dan and Bethel. He inaugurated a whole new system of worship. And so this is kind of a zoom in to Israel here. You see Dan in the north and then Bethel at the south, both border towns basically. And this was thought of as, well, this is convenient. The southern kingdom of Judah would still worship God at the temple in Jerusalem. But oftentimes it was only a ritual worship. It was just what they were expecting to be done. And it's really heartbreaking to see the beginning of the moral and religious decay of the divided kingdom. And what you're going to see as you read through the divided kingdom, the points where things go well and the people return to God, that's when you kind of, as you're reading, I don't know about you, but for me, I'm like, yes, this is great, and it feels so good when they have a good king, but it feels so bad when they have a bad king. And I think part of these histories, I think part of the goal is for us to try to see through God's eyes about how all this unfolds and try to understand it from his can't fully understand it. Gradually, the Levites move back south. They go back to Judah. And so the divided kingdom is going to continue on for about 200 years, one of the darkest periods in Old Testament history. Judah and Israel warred against each other at various times. There were battles ongoing within and without. Out of 39 kings and 2 kingdoms, 13 were murdered by their own people. So lots of conspiracies and assassinations. All of this goes back to an aspect of sin. And the welfare of the kings and their kingdoms was directly related to their service to God. The kings in the south were direct descendants of David through Solomon, and this was in fulfillment of the promise made to David in 2 Samuel 7. He talks about, I will set up your seed after you who will come from your body. I will establish his kingdom. And of course, we have some good kings in Judah, but none in Israel. Well, that's going to be where we end up. We're at slide 13 right now, and we'll continue that Wednesday night, Lord willing. Any comments? We're going to continue that next Sunday. Thank you for keeping me on tack with that, Murphy.
Stephen, on page 96, on number 8 at the bottom, what did you say the David's sons who rebelled against their father were? Absalom and
Adonijah.
I misunderstood that.
That's all right. That's all right. Appreciate that. Anything else? All right. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for the discussion and the involvement.
It's interesting. I